Speaker of the House of Assembly, the Honorable Claudius Francis, Governor General Emerita, Her Excellency Dylan Poulet Louisi, Ministers of Cabinet, the Honorable Joachim Henry and Mrs. Claudia Henry, the Honorable Virginia Poyot, Dr. Virginia Poyot, Senator Lisa Jawahir, Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, Cabinet Secretary, Mr. Ben Emmanuel, Permanent Secretary, Mr. Darren Montrop, Acting PS Foreign External Affairs, Mr. Guillaume Simon, other government officials and civil society representatives, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen present and online, and last but absolutely not least, my dear wife, Michelle. One of the most poignant admonitions of the great African leader, Amilcar Cabral, at the height of the liberation struggle in Africa was to warn, and I quote, that our most fundamental struggle is the battle against our own weaknesses and contradictions. It is an easy temptation on an occasion like this to speak platitudes about national progress and to chronicle the difficulties overcome on the long, painful journey that is our history. In St. Lucia, we have cultivated a mythology around the notion of nation and society that provides us with a comfortable cloak that conceals our underlying nakedness. In all of our narratives about both nation and society, there is an implied unity of purpose and public consensus that is not reflected in the reality of the discourse in the public street, in our social intercourse, and is certainly negated by the volume and nature of crime in our society. Tonight, I would like to make an uncomfortable exploration into the structural cracks in the edifice of the nation and the widening fissures in the fabric of our society. But we can keep it simple. I could say, Mama Ladi, quick. History is a long journey, a long road in the journey of becoming. For us, the journey started just before we became a nation with what Walcott describes as, and I quote, the long groan that was slavery. The vehicle then was not a bus, it was a carriage. And the passengers on that journey were not us, but the white colonizers. That journey was not a process of becoming, but a process of removing. That carriage was not horse-drawn. We were the horses that propelled this vehicle towards a destination of wealth extraction and imperial ambition. Increasingly, evidence is revealing how profitable that journey was. A recent book by Professor Howard French, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, revealed that the Caribbean was, and I quote, the boiler room of the North Atlantic economy. In the late 18th century, white Jamaicans enjoyed an annual income 35 times that of British North Americans. More slaves were trafficked to Martinique than to the entire United States, while the French so prized tiny Guadeloupe that they swapped it for the whole of French Canada. At several points of this journey, the exhaustion of our exploitation led to breakdowns, until finally the spirit of resistance triumphed, and the horses were no longer prepared to carry the burden and the baggage of the colonial drivers. We arrived then at the point where, to transpose the words of Robert Frost, two roads diverge in a wood, and we took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That was the stage of our journey when we became the drivers of our own destiny, swapping the blood and sweat propelled carriage for a bus of our own, driven by our own, towards the destination of our own becoming. And here we are today, 43 years on this journey of becoming. In the life of a person, this is an attainment of adulthood. In the chronology of history, we are still in the infant and formative years of our nationhood and in the shaping of our Caribbean civilization. And now, let us take stock of where we are in this 43-year journey and how are we really doing in building a nation and shaping a society. And as I do so, I will juxtapose our experience with those who have carried similar baggage and overcome comparable burdens successfully. For starters, let's explore the notions of nation and society. Historically, nations have been forged by blood and struggle, but united by a better vision of themselves. They have been propelled by a notion of greatness above the circumstances and the accidents of history from which they are birthed. If you think about it, the progress of every nation has been constructed on its self-definition of its own greatness. There is the American ideal, and you can see it in the slide here. There is the Chinese dream. There is Singapore's global city ethos. Nearer to home, there is the Cuban construct of non-negotiable sovereignty, la patria, and the sacred obligation of internationalist duty. There is the cultural assertion of brand Jamaica, and there is the idea of Barbados, which we see evolving on steroids under the leadership of Prime Minister Mia Mottley. As Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves describes it, and I quote, "More than any other Caribbean society, with the possible exception of Cuba, Barbados has arrived at a place where its uniqueness presents a model of governance, political economy, way of life, and social order. And the idea of Barbados," he says, and I quote, "is a transcendental idea which infuses the body politic and society to consolidated progressive achievements nationally." End of quote. The nation therefore requires an ideological glue that motivates the people to look in the mirror to see their better selves and to look upwards to see better tomorrows. Societies, on the other hand, are more organic associations of community, bound by cultural compromises of a common condition. A society is a dynamic and fluid community with its own inherent tensions and contradictions, but it is a construct that induces us, despite our differences, to evolve shared practices, a language that bridges our mental frameworks, fusions of culture woven from many historical strands. It is the extent to which these contradictions find common ground that social harmony can be established. Moving beyond the definitions, let us now turn our gaze inward to our nation and to our society. What is the nation of St. Lucia? And what is St. Lucian society? Is a nation its infrastructure, its roads, bridges, buildings? Or is the stature of a nation the height of its skyscrapers? Or is it the accumulated catalogue of its collective accomplishments? Nothing addresses this question better than Derek Walcott in his poem, The Sea is History. And I quote, "Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grave vault, the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history." Walcott's chronicling of our journey from the Babylonian bondage, what he calls the Babylonian bondage of the Middle Passage, to the lamentations of slavery, described by him as bones ground by windmills into marl and cornmeal, to the jubilation of emancipation, which he says vanished, and I quote again, "swiftly as the sea lace dries in the sun," and takes us right up to independence when he says each rock broke into its own island. It was the breakup of the West Indies Federation that resulted in each rock breaking into its own island. But it did not take us long to realize that standing as singular rocks in a world of hegemonic alliances was not the pathway to prosperity. It was our own Sir Arthur Lewis who pointed out in his definitive text, The Agony of the Little Eight, to the imperative of unity within the Eastern Caribbean that eventually became the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. While Sir Arthur called for a political union of the Little Eight, he was a bit over-optimistic and may have overlooked how geography shapes the character of politics. The sea surrounding and separating small island states may well be a contributing circumstance to the insularity of our political culture. But that's another story altogether. The genius of the OECS integration project is that it focuses on the practical matters associated with the benefits of scale and functional cooperation to building our nations. What defines a nation? Is it the catalogue of conquests of empires past and the imposition of contemporary control? Or is it the humanity and civility of its culture, the distinctiveness of its forms of social interaction, and its unique and singular contribution to the global community? St. Lucia as a nation cannot define itself through the projection of military might, as so many aspire to do on the global stage. But military muscle is not the only expression of power, even though the capacity for coercion and the means to impose one's diktat is a law of the global jungle. There are many expressions of power, and it is for a nation to identify and define the comparative strengths that will represent the projection of its own power. So Cuba set itself the goal of becoming a global medical power, and today the health of its population is on par and even better than many developed countries. The Cuban Medical Brigade is the face of its internationalism. Its pharmaceutical innovations have cured thousands, and as of 2016, coming closer to home, it had trained 30,000 physicians from over 100 countries. The Singapore model is a world-recognized exemplar of a small state with good governance, meritocracy, political stability, economic transformation, technological innovation, and harmonious social order. And significantly for our purposes tonight, Singapore is a country of 281 square miles. St. Lucia is 238 square miles. Singapore did not become a success overnight, but was able to lift itself from an Asian backwater plagued by major problems, including overpopulation, unemployment, major housing shortages, and racial tension, to world-class status. And you can see in this slide here the exact location in 1960 and in 2022, and just on an infrastructural level, see the difference. For our purposes tonight, the most important lesson from Singapore is that they built a nation by addressing what I will later describe as the 4 pillars of nation building: a guiding ideology, a strong sustainable economy, governance of high integrity, and institutional dynamism. And they literally created a unified society with a national identity from a diverse assortment of ethnicities. The Emirate of Dubai, for another example, has positioned itself globally as a civilization of the future, but anchored in its Arab traditions, densely cosmopolitan. Almost 90% of the population of Dubai are expats, but nationals are privileged. The real beginning of a nation, of building a nation, is to conceive an aspirational idea of the best that we can be, and to make that aspiration one that transcends every tribal affiliation within the national space, including the diaspora, and to systematically pursue that dream. It would be well to remind ourselves of Naipaul's advice that after, and I quote him, "After all, we make ourselves according to the ideas that we have of our possibilities." End of quote. And to be guided also by his admonition that the world is what it is. Men, and maybe the gender thing is deliberate, men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it. What are the features of our nation that I see? What is our national character? What is the complexion of our society? Both Derek and Sir Arthur on many occasions remarked on the soul of the nation. Where are the expressions of our civilization, our museums, art galleries, our theaters, performing and recreational spaces, our national archives, which is supposed to be the repository of our memories? Walcott's dream was a republic of the arts. Where are the public spaces that refresh our spirits and reconcile concrete with grass and trees? Oases of calm in the bustle of business. So how do we shape that future? Martin Luther King spoke to the fierce urgency of now as a challenge of responsibility. There are things that must be done and must be done now if we are to alter the circumstances of our condition. And there are changes that, if done with fierce urgency, will change the trajectory of our history. There is an inseparable relationship between building a nation and shaping a society. Both challenges are the responsibility of all, but with nuanced obligations to different actors. Because the construct of the nation is in the domain of governance, and its remit spans an ideological, territorial, and institutional architecture, it sits above the society, and it establishes the parameters of the potential and the possibilities for shaping the society. The responsibility for the nation, it is commonly said, lies with our leaders, as it should. But what is often lost is that every citizen must assume some measure of leadership responsibility. Let us never lose sight of the fact, even if for 15 minutes every 5 years, the people are the sovereign power in our nation. Above and beyond the sovereignty of the nation is the sanctity and the sovereignty of the people. And in building the nation, this must be woven into the DNA of our institutions. Public services upholding the rights of citizens and responsive to their needs. Every one of us must exercise leadership wherever we are planted, in the everyday and in every way. The unraveling of a society starts with small infractions and escalates exponentially. And how can I count the ways in St. Lucia? They are innumerable. You start with minor breaches of traffic rules, and they escalate to lawlessness on the roads. The exercise of courtesy to each other in all encounters, and note again the increasing incivility on the road, and also the ease with which ordinary arguments and differences of opinion deteriorate to violence. All of this is a worrying indicator of the decline of basic manners. The extension of respect to all, regardless of their position or socioeconomic status, and the appearance as opposed to the arrogant assumption of privilege based on socioeconomic class or occupational position. I've heard so many instances where people who feel that they're so entitled tell people, don't you know who I am? So what? We all have the equal rights of citizenship. Our conventional leaders, political, religious, social, civic, who are the drivers of both the vehicles of nation and society, cannot take us forward by staring in the rearview mirror as the past is the road already driven. They must look forward, but they are unable to drive safely if they are fixated on what is immediately ahead. Not at the next 5 yards or even the next 5 miles, but further ahead, conscious of the condition of the road, and most importantly, fixed to our ultimate destination. We all know instinctively where we need to go and what we need to do. During the period 2001 to 2022, we have had 5 personalities as our prime ministers. And I've done a textual analysis using a word cloud of a random independent speech from each of them. The rhetoric is the same. The language urges national unity, the call to country above self, the priority on the people, the will to succeed. Looming large in the lexicon are the words you see in that map of St. Lucia. St. Lucia, country, people, national, government, economic, respect. If their words align, what is preventing the actions from aligning? Is it the inherent rules of the political game? If it is, then it takes an exceptional caliber of leadership to reach across that divide and give Jack his jacket. But let's not dump it all on the politicians. The same applies to our leadership in all spheres. Denominational differences. We've heard the churches competing for market share and decrying each other. Everybody else is a child of Satan except in my religion. Business rivalries posing as competitiveness, to name a few. If we don't know where we are going, as I said, any road will take us there. And we certainly don't want to end up in Grosile. No prejudice to the district rep in Grosile if the planned destination was Vieux-Fort. Allow me to end by summarizing some of the critical initiatives that I believe ought to be done to earnestly build a nation and shape our society. 1, defining the national ideology, the vision of the St. Lucia that we want. A deep and wide process of national consultation and dialogue should be undertaken that requires that we move beyond the rhetorical flourishes to tangible demonstrations of common purpose. This process must be co-led responsibly by our leaders, political and social, especially in the volatile, uncertain, and complex times that we now face. And leaders must listen more than they speak. And I have a quote from Gladwell: "In times of difficulty, what we want from our leaders is not the benefit of their expertise, but the benefit of their humility." Let difference be a distinction and not a division. So let our tribal affiliations, be they religious or political or social, not supersede our national identity. The second thing is institutional revitalization. The invigoration of our national institutions with a responsive dynamism, starting with the democratization of Parliament and our governance mechanisms. The restoration of service in the public service and consumer rights in the private sector. The malfunction of institutions is the major factor accounting for why nations fail. And I would urge everyone to read that book, Why Nations Fail. Reshaping our systems of governance through constitutional reform that establishes clear processes for upholding integrity and for grassroots consultation. Making Parliament a more effective instrument of governance and ensuring continuity of national development initiatives. Can approval, for example, of national development plans be done by Parliament so that we are not subject to a one step forward, two steps backward walls between administrations? From conversation with our erudite speaker, who I'm honored to call a friend of the House, I was advised that Parliament does have such a window of opportunity that can be turned into a door that opens wider avenues of people consultation and participation in the business of governance. And with his permission, I will quote verbatim his advice, so I can't be taken out of context. Standing Order 48.2, Mr. Speaker, you said, makes provision for a period of time to elapse between the first and second readings of a bill. Regarding the first reading of a bill, all this entails is for the name of the bill to be read out in the House. Debate takes place upon the second reading. The period between the first and second readings can be utilized for public discourse on the said bill. A golden opportunity, therefore, to bring Parliament to the community. Imagine significant legislation that has far-reaching implications for specific sectors, whether we're talking in tourism, in business, consumer matters, whatever, being brought by specialized House committees to town hall meetings all over the country and special seminars with the sectoral groups concerned for deep discussion and consultation. The third thing is design policies or create or strengthen mechanisms of economic inclusion. We do live in a capitalist society, but rising inequality globally is fueling xenophobia, anger, crime. You speak to youth who are engaged in criminal activity, and you will come to appreciate that despair and hopelessness is what fuels the sense of live hard, die fast. Some examples of economic inclusion could be, for example, strengthening and empowering the credit unions so that they can broaden financial inclusion, provide avenues for participation of even the poorest in investment through mutual funds, innovate on SUSU-type revolving saving plans, and so much more. We could require foreign investors to reserve a percentage, whether it's 30, 40% of all investment value, for local participation by citizens at home and abroad through local financial intermediary institutions like the credit unions I mentioned earlier, so that a cleaner in this office here can have shares. If we invest in a regional transport system, a cleaner here can buy shares through the mutual fund in the credit union, and also using the Eastern Caribbean Securities Exchange. The fourth thing is rethink education. Education can no longer be just a certification thing, not just knowledge, but human and technical competencies. Malcolm Gladwell again reminds us, and I quote, "The key to good decision-making is not knowledge, it is understanding. We are swimming in the former, that is knowledge, and we are desperately lacking in the latter, that is understanding." Our education system, therefore, must produce critical and creative thinkers, caring and committed citizens, empowered entrepreneurial actors equipped with 21st century competencies. Rethinking education is the key to the fifth imperative, strengthening civil society and empowerment of citizens. Now, this is particularly challenging in this period of fake news and manufactured consent in social media. But there are two dimensions to this necessity. One is the need for civic education from cradle to grave as an essential tool of empowerment of citizens. Unless you know and you understand your inalienable rights as a citizen, a constitution is only words on a page. And civic education is not an academic thing, for as Confucius said, the essence of knowledge is having it to apply it. It would be necessary to create or build on existing avenues of civic engagement and empowerment. So the elevation of traditions such as the Susu, embodied in the credit union for financial inclusion and empowerment, the Kudme, important in building citizen involvement in the improvement of their own communities rather than rely on government to do everything. The adoption of the Haitian concept of Teta Sam, which goes further than Kudme. Teta Sam really is about the meeting of minds, hands, and hearts for common purpose, mechanisms of consultation, discussion, and action. Yesterday, I visited Sir Didacus Jules to offer respects for his award. And in discussion, he raised the issue of a thesis done by Raisa Joseph, exploring the potential of Kudme as a tool for nation building, social inclusion, consolidation of identity, and reinforcing resilience. Now, neither Sir Didacus nor myself have read this thesis, but we both felt it's something that should be read. And knowing Raisa, and from discussions with her at FRC, I have a sense that this is where this is going, and it's something that we need to take into account. These suggestions on the fundamentals of building the nation set the tone for shaping the society. I've already spoken to the imperative of public education, citizen empowerment, and civic education. But shaping a society is fundamentally about managing the many tribes that we all inhabit. All societies face the same fundamental challenge of forging an elemental and binding unity out of their diversity. I described this earlier in the case of Singapore. Each of us here share multiple identities, and we belong to different tribes. Politically, we are red or yellow or blue or colorless. Spiritually, we can be Catholic, Adventist, Pentecostal, Rastafarian, or any other, because they are no children of a lesser God. And we can belong to a multitude of social and or civic clubs and organizations, or not belong at all. These are the tribes that we inhabit. But there are some tribes that are common to us all. It is the tribal affiliations that unite us that we must privilege above those that divide us. Yet paradoxically, we must find accommodation for the differentiation of tribes so that while respecting our differences, we can share a common destiny. That is the intersection between building a nation and shaping a society. The intersection between these tribal affiliations are what determines our primary identity, whether as individual or as nation. So as you can see in this slide that is being shown, for the political loyalists, party affiliation, as shown with the box with votes, is greater than national affiliation, which is the flag circle. Have you noticed the phenomena of seasonal participation? Some celebrate independence fervently only when their party is in power and are indifferent when it is out. The nation is strongest when the fever of national belonging is greater than the pull of partisan affiliation. In closing, I wish to focus on the seminal issue of leadership and its role in the building of a nation and the shaping of a society. And as I return to this conceptual slide, showing the key elements and the relationship between these two historical imperatives, building the nation and shaping the society is a symbiotic process. The one strengthens the other. But it all starts with our vision of ourselves, hence the umbrella, and the aspiration to our fullest potential. Leadership is essential to this process, and as stated earlier, we're talking about leadership in all domains, the political, the economic, the community, the religious. But it is to our political leadership of all colors, as the apex of power and influence in the nation, that we must look for direction on these imperatives. While we all must play our part and make our contribution wherever we are planted, it is our political leadership that sets the tone and determines the temperature of the national dialogue. Now, historical time is not political time. And what is historically necessary is not always what is politically expedient. But we must be guided by a sense of urgency that is informed by the strategic necessity as well as operational functionality. Let me punctuate this to show why the fierce urgency of now that I referenced at the beginning of this lecture is so important. Our electoral cycles are 5-year rotations. 5 years in the hunger of opposition may seem a long time, but 5 years in the pressure cooker of power is not really 5 chronological years. Let's do the maths. A 5-year term equals 1,165 days. 365 days a year by 5. When you deduct public holidays, weekends, paid leave, using an average of 14 days paid leave, you are left with a real working time of 233 days out of the 365 days per year. Now, when you take these 233 days in the year, in working days per year, this is 233 days, but 24-hour days. You break that down to 8-hour days, which is the working time. We recalibrate, we end up with an equivalent of 388 days to deliver in a 5-year term. Put simply, 5 years in office equals 388 working days to deliver, 8-hour working days to deliver. That is the fierce urgency of now that must drive the approach to building the nation and shaping the society. And it is an urgency that must fire us all, not just our political leaders. I leave you with a ballad of simple wisdom by Merchant, which, although directed to his Trinikin, is relevant to us all. Like the Jesus would say, lick it.
So come let us go hand in hand, because this is our land. Come my brother, come my sister, and let us build a nation together.
Jamais aller devant si nous pas ensemble. We can never go forward if not together. Thank you for your attention, and God bless our nation.